ran through this presentation with my 3-year-old daughter yesterday. I'm expecting this to go slightly a bit smoother. I'm kind of expecting slightly less disruptions depending on how much Dave heckles me from down on this front table here. Also not expecting to have to escort anyone to the toilet, and you'll be able to knock me over with a feather if anyone demands that I stop and play dollies with them. So as Will said, I'm Paul Burridge. I head up the export and regional operations for Summit Forest New Zealand. I think Rory mentioned it earlier, we're a large forest owner, primarily in the far north of New Zealand, but looking to invest in other forests around the country as well. More importantly, I guess in the context of today, we are a very large exporter through New Zealand, rapidly growing business there. But in a broader context, through our parent company, Sumitomo Corporation, we trade wood fibre at a very large scale globally from many different markets, and that's in different forms. So we have a very large forest holding in Russia. It's about 2.7 million hectares, which is just a small holding. Then we also have interests in Chile and log trading and that sort of thing out of North America as well. So we feed into a very big network of wood fibre trading. Sumitomo itself, just for a bit of background, 400-year-old company back to its roots, so mind-boggling for most of us Kiwis. The corporation aspect of the business, which is our parent company, dates back about 100 years, and that's the trading arm of the bigger Sumitomo group. So Sumitomo Corporation is a very large international trading house, probably one of the biggest trading houses, something like 80,000 employees globally, 800 subsidiary companies, of which Summit Forests is one of those. And we have business interests in trading across sort of 65 countries globally. But enough about how wonderful we are. You're here, well, I'm here to talk to you about, our global markets and what the future looks like. I always think when you're looking forward, it sometimes pays to look in the rear vision mirror as well, and it gives a bit of context on where we've come from, where we are now, and where we're likely to go. So I've titled this Past, Present, Future, and obviously we're pretty confident that the outlook looks bright, so we'll work through that today. If you cast your minds back to 1995, around this time period, most of it was a bit of a different environment back there, and apologies if there's any South Africans in the room, you're going to get a bit of a hard time during this presentation. The South Africans had the Rugby World Cup, and our guys were holding buckets on the sideline, and apologies to Sean down here. It was only the second time the America's Cup left America for a new Down Under, and the political environment was slightly different back then as well. The government of the day, obviously, Jim Bolger was our Prime Minister. Around this time, obviously, a lot of you were starting to invest in forest or already been planting forest, and the RDL guys will notice that I borrowed a picture from their website, or 2 pictures from the website. I wanted to be factually accurate, and I saw that on the what are we? Oh, we're up to no, great on the board out the front there. So I need you all to concentrate on these numbers as well. So looking back around this 1995 level, and the reason I say I need you to concentrate on these numbers, I've got a memory like a sieve, and when I'm 20 slides deep into this presentation, I'm not going to be able to remember what these numbers were. So global population at the time, about 5.7 billion people. So I got that number right, that's fantastic. Our main export markets at the time were Korea and Japan. Obviously our export in terms of volume was slightly less than what it is today, so we were at 5 million cubic metres per year, and our total export earnings from forestry was $3.3 billion. Still the 3rd biggest export earner at the time, but quite a small number compared to today's figure. Take note of these graphs because we're going to come back to them throughout the presentation as well. And interesting, the asset size was obviously a bit smaller than what it is today, but you can see from the image there that it was obviously increasing at the time. Also note, obviously around this sort of time period here, what the export of logs looked like and the market breakdown, and you can see that China barely even featured. Just to touch quickly on, what the split was between export and domestic. It was much more heavily weighted towards domestic around this time frame, and you can see obviously our domestic cut has increased over that time period as well. but you can see a big jump in export. Also pay attention to the second graphic up there as well, because we'll come back to a similar one shortly, which indicates obviously what the split in export was at the time, 1996, between, I guess, our value-added product and logs, and you can see logs features quite heavily there. I heard someone else mention it earlier, but obviously the collective vision in the room, you know, we've got to be pretty thankful these days, especially for us as, you know, as a log exporter as well, in terms of, you know, you've set up the base for what we're currently selling to overseas markets and cutting domestically in New Zealand. We couldn't be doing what we're doing now without you. So, we cast our minds forward. It's obviously a different environment that we live in today. Again, sorry to the South African guys. I can tell you a bit of an anecdote about this. Obviously, South Africa's last attempt at a World Cup was slightly less successful than 1995. I've just employed a South African fellow, great guy. He turned up about 2 weeks before he started, keen as mustard, wanting to fill his office with all his gear, and he had a framed photo which was in bubble wrap, and so I had to have a look at it, and it was the South Africans beating the All Blacks in the '95 World Cup. And I must have been telling Steve about this when we were having dinner one night. He said, "You're a Japanese company, or Japanese-owned company, right? Get a photo of that and put it on his desk for when he arrives." So that's exactly what I did. Obviously, America's Cup, we're on slightly faster boats, so there's been quite a bit of development in that kind, just to put in context of what happens over a 20-year period, and, you know, obviously powered by cycles now. And politically, a much different environment in terms of Winston making all the decisions on what our government looks like now. So let me see if I can remember these numbers, and if not, someone shout them out to me on where we've come from. So we've gone from 5.71 billion in terms of population over a 20-year period to 7.4 billion. So, you know, exponential population growth that we're seeing globally, and most of that is through our large Asian countries, so India, China. The big jump that you'll see there is in our export volume. So we've gone from 5.5 million cubic metres per year, geez, I'm going all right here actually, to 17 million. So that's a 200% increase. And I could only go back as far as 2004 on the export earnings. So for the export earnings, we've obviously risen by 56% over that 13-year period. So quite a big jump. And obviously our asset size has increased as well. I mentioned we would come back to this other graphic down the bottom with the total export volume, and obviously you can see that highlighted in red. Over a 10-year period, China has gone from essentially taking 2 million cubic metres or jazz per year to a whopping 12 million at the moment. So they're a significant player in our export market and very, very important to us. Interestingly enough, over that 20-year period, I mentioned before, that you can see that the split between value-add product and logs is fairly similar to what it was back then. What's driving this? Well, obviously population growth has a huge impact on it as well. And Tom touched before about, you know, the directive from China in terms of investment in infrastructure, cities, and so that's really driven a huge amount of our log export growth. You can see the bottom graphic indicates the GDP growth within China and India. Japan sort of bounced along a little bit. Korea doesn't even actually feature on this. And obviously India and China have been our big movers in terms of GDP growth and spend. So both of those GDP growths actually correlate quite a bit with the increase in volumes into those markets. This is just a different way of representing that graphically, but you can see that obviously China makes up 20% of the world's population, India close behind. India is actually going to overtake China very shortly. And to the right, obviously China is a significant economy on global scales, and that's going to change shortly too. They are going to take up #1 position.
We'll see about that.
So in terms of importance, like I do talk about how important China is, and I will be a bit China-centric today just because of obviously the weighting in terms of how, how much volume they take from us. 72% of our log volume goes to China at the moment. 24% is made up to our other two sort of key markets, Korea and India. India's obviously growing, Korea's quite stable, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Tom talked earlier just around some of the markets where they go. Obviously, the processed product goes to slightly different markets, which is represented there quite well. So we're seeing, obviously, processed product going more to Australia, the US, and into Japan as well, whereas logs are obviously quite heavily weighted towards our Asian markets. So to talk about the markets a little bit in themselves, China is just a fascinating place to visit if you ever get the chance to go there in terms of their development. I've been heading up there for about 5 years and just seen a huge change over that time period as well. It fascinates me every time you go there, you see these massive apartment blocks and complexes being built and cranes swinging and just development everywhere. And that's primarily what a lot of our radiated pine has gone into in the past. So over that sort of 10-year period, it's been for plywood and boxing and formwork for these massive concrete structures. I had to put up the guy standing on top of the log truck because I just think that typifies China, especially when that load is about to be put on that log truck. So, yeah, so but it's a market which is obviously really developed for us over that 10-year period. Just quickly just showing the growth, and apologies I haven't been able to put the 2016 data into this yet, but the top just shows that rise that we've seen in China. The bottom graphic is really just representing what the breakdown is between what their production has been in China in terms of their native forests in China, what their import volume has been in terms of logs, and what their import volume is in terms of lumber. And I'll talk about this a little bit later as we talk about how the, demand and market is changing in China. But the great thing for us is that the volume coming out of their native forests is decreasing, and we're seeing an increase in export volume or import volume for export logs from New Zealand. Korea, our number 2 market. It's a much more mature market than China. China's very much selling to either, for us as exporters, selling to log wholesalers and a mixture of end users or manufacturers there. Whereas Korea is primarily selling all to end users. So they're a lot more specific on the grade mix that they want because they're obviously processing the logs themselves. And quality is obviously a big issue into China as well, so they're very tight on their quality specs. It's like I mentioned, it's a very stable market, so we do about 2.4 million jazz a year into Korea, and that's been very stable over the years. And you can see that by the graphic there showing that the 5-year average 2016 and 2017 figures are fairly well similar. India is a different market again, a totally different beast. It's a very fragmented market compared to China and Korea. There's something like 600 end customers across the 8 ports that make up India. Credit risk is often an issue into India, so most log exporters, when exporting to India, will sell to maybe 30 customers over a single vessel just to spread their risk. It's a market that shows huge potential to grow with growing population and GDP and development. But we've sort of really been yet to see that in the last couple of years. We've been waiting with bated breath, hoping that it's going to happen. And unfortunately, 2017 figures for export to India are slightly down on 2016 figures. Some of the reasons that cause this, it's a market that doesn't really have too much seasonal kind of influence, which is more evident in China and Korea, and can be at times driven by rumours and sort of political decisions. And we see that at the moment with the implementation of a GST into India, which has really caused quite significant cash flow issues to some of the log buyers there. So obviously over this time we've seen a huge growth in volume to these Asian markets, and again I'll be a bit China-centric here just because it's been our really big growth market. So how are they handling this obviously this massive increase in volume that's coming from, I guess, New Zealand and the other importing countries? Well, in China, if you ask for something, it gets built. And so over a 10-year period, they've built 11 new ports to handle log volume. So that's just log ports. They're not small ports either, and in context, 11 new log ports is the total number of log ports that we have out of New Zealand. So they've done that in a 10-year period, and they are not small ports either. So if you imagine the port of Tauranga, whoever's been there, every single one of them would be much bigger than the port of Tauranga. So I didn't mention it earlier, but obviously New Zealand, we export, being in the bottom of the South Pacific, we tend to export to the sort of the southern part of China, and that's where that's where the ports have been spread across as well, which is good for us. The photos there are from probably the newest log import port in China. It's about as far up the Yangtze River as you can get with a fully laden log ship. It's a port called Xingminzhou, and this facility is just, it's unbelievable. So you look one way, and as far as you can see are these 100 metre tall shore cranes, and they are impressive beasts, so I'd hate to be standing at the top. You turn around, look the other way, and they're as far as you can see as well. Little tip, if you ever want to make a lot of money, I think get into the bricklaying business in China. The footprint of this port would be probably 2 or 3 times the size of Port of Tauranga, completely laid in bricks. It just blows my mind. Actually, the one thing I did forget to mention, so they build a port, and then they need volume to go through the port. So what do? They build a big industrial park next to the port and encourage customers to come there and process their logs. So right next to this Xingminzhou port is a huge industrial park with, I guess, state-of-the-art processing facilities so that they can encourage log volume to come up to this port and attract it away from other ports. How do you get the volume to those processing sites? You give them, you give those customers a rent holiday for a couple of years. So we're seeing quite a lot of volume go to this port now. These are 2 other facilities that we've visited recently. The top one's in a place called Jaco, which is sort of about as far north as New Zealand logs go. This facility is only a year old, and it's quite a big industrial park. So basically, again, as far as the eyes can see, this probably only represents about 2/3 of, or maybe even only a half of the industrial park. And there would be a couple of hundred processing lines through this facility. I was talking to a gentleman the other day that is involved with this park, and he said they're about to put in about 100 kiln drying facilities into this facility within the next year. And the intention there is that they're wanting to add value to the product that we're selling there. Just below it is a phenomenal facility called Lulai, and it's in the same province of China. It's quite close. This is a relatively newly developed facility as well, and it's got some local government investment into it too. I don't think the graphic or the image really represents it as big and as massive as it is. But you can see these sheds that's spread out either side from the entranceway. There's 16 of these sheds, and they'll probably be at least 400 metres long and a couple of 100 metres wide. Again, filled with state-of-the-art processing facilities. So we're definitely seeing a change from the safety jandal kind of manual labour approach that we've always seen in China to this further development, and I think Tom touched on it earlier in terms of developing the product a lot further. So the middle image there is from inside the Lulai facility, obviously the kiln drying facilities, and then you see a timber stacker there as well, which you'd see in most New Zealand operations. So it's not uncommon to go over there and actually think that you're looking at a kind of a highly mechanised New Zealand processing operation. Other than the faces looking back at you there. So we are really seeing a change, I guess, in China in terms of what they are doing with our logs, in terms of adding extra value and that sort of thing as well. And we certainly heard Tom talk about that earlier, with essentially them doing the same finger joining product and sort of copying what they're doing there. The top image is some pruned components from one of our large prune customers in southern China. So that is being turned into baby furniture, so they're components to make cots. The timber slab there with FMNZ's logo on it, I put that in because this was a bit of a surprise for me when I saw this over there. That came from a KI log, and so KI log's not considered one of the highest value logs. That log was then being finger jointed and turned into a higher value product, similar to what Tom was talking about before. So whereas traditionally that log was going into a much lower end use, it's now getting much more value added onto it by the customers over there. So they're really, I guess, seizing the opportunity to try and make some more money from those logs, and obviously the markets are changing there for it too. What's also sort of happening in China as well at the moment, and we're seeing this, and it's great for us as log exporters. Not so great for our American counterparts, but we're seeing a substitution of radiata for uses which have predominantly been from higher end use, from higher value species such as hemlock and Douglas fir and that sort of thing out of the States, and that's because radiata is cheaper as a log to buy. But as they're doing that, they're figuring out the versatility of it and the value they can add. So it's great for us. And then obviously what that means is higher prices because they can add value. So they're able to pay us higher prices as well as the supply and the demand side of things. So yeah, that obviously shows that at Wolfgate prices, and that's a 3-year average, are increasing over time, which is fantastic for you guys as investors. And also the price landed at beside the vessel is also increasing. Can't talk about international markets without talking about shipping briefly, and I'll come back to this again shortly. Ocean freight is a very volatile beast, as you can see in that graphic there. So this just shows in indices. You can see 18 months ago, in the beginning of 2016, we were probably in the lowest time that we've ever seen for shipping. It baffled me at the time that you could put a log on a ship, send it to China for cheaper than what you could cart it from the forest to the port. So really interesting kind of concept in that regard. We've come back off that as all things happen with shipping, and I'll talk that through shortly. But historically, we're still at pretty good freight rate levels. So that's the sort of current state of play, and I guess as a forest company looking to invest, but also a log trader and that sort of thing, we're always looking forward. So what do we see the future? Well, obviously, I think the All Blacks will probably be holding the World Cup above their heads again at the next World Cup. The America's Cup's coming home again. We don't know what the vessels are going to look like yet, but they won't be catamarans, and I'm picking Steve for Prime Minister. All right. So what are our global markets going to look like? I kept talking about this population growth and GDP as well. We continue to see exponential population growth, so 8.5 million. So again, up 14%, and that's primarily going to be in our large Asian markets. We expect in the next 3 years to increase our export volume by another 2 million JAS to 19 million cubic metres per year. And we expect our export earnings to go up another, $1 billion to 6.3 billion. So we're forecasting significant growth over the coming years, which is great. And you can see that obviously in the graphic there too. We are predicting, and it's easy to predict this, that China and India are going to probably be our dominant markets in Asia, but we still think that Korea is going to obviously play a big part as well. Just to put in context, I won't talk about this too much, but this is obviously what our harvest looks like in New Zealand over the coming years. So we keep hearing about this wall of wood. I don't personally think that there's going to be a big wall of wood. I think we're most of the way up it, to be honest. So you see it flat lines there at about 35 million tonne a year to be harvested. We're around about 32, 33 million tonne a year at the moment, if my numbers are right. So we're getting close to the top, but the interesting thing is we obviously go into a bit of a dip in 20 years' time. So that bears some consideration. I'm not going to admit how long this slide took to make because my boss is here and I quite value my job, but it took a little bit of time. What does 19 million cubic metres look like for export? Well, it looks like 1.2 million truck movements to the port each year. And it looks like 542 fully laden 35,000 tonne vessels to predominantly our Asian markets. So 542 fully laden log vessels. So I tried to represent that on the image here, but I couldn't quite get there. So there's a hint. Going to run a quick competition though, because I actually know exactly how many log vessels are on this slide. So Will's going to help me out. He's going to take 3 guesses, and for anyone who can get the closest, there's a stunning prize. And I know there's 220. Who said 380? 382. That was bloody close. Are you a Wellingtonian by any chance? Oh, God. Well, I'm a staunch Wellingtonian. It's been a tough year. And a bottle of Manuka honey there for you too. So it's a tough road being a Wellingtonian rugby supporter, but fortunately the boys got home last night and it's only taken them 17 years to win another final. So, but that's what 19 million jazz of export looks like on an annual basis. Where's it going to go? Obviously we talk about this. I've talked about it a number of times, and there's the proof that it was 382. So I wasn't lying. Obviously, we'll talk about these Asian markets and China being so important to us. And sorry, Sean, the numbers are saying that they're going to be the biggest economy by the year 2020, which is only
3 years.
at $25 trillion US per year. So that's a massive economy. We think that obviously Japan and India are going to be scrapping it out for fourth position, around about 10 trillion per year. So we see massive growth in that regard. But we're seeing a change in the population and the makeup of the population in China as well. And again, I'm going to be a little bit China-centric here. So there's this rapidly growing middle class in China and upper to middle class as well. And that's represented by the dark blue in this slide. They're obviously more affluent and they're not afraid to spend money on luxury goods and higher-end furniture and that sort of thing. So we're seeing quite a change there, and it comes back to that value add that we were talking about earlier. I keep talking about babies. A lot of it's going into baby furniture and cots, so an important market for us. Demand-wise, and being a trading house and obviously a forest owner and investor as well, we're all about analysing numbers, and Sumitomo are very good at this. I won't go into the details of what's on the slide here, but basically over a 3-year period, the Chinese government is implementing a ban on native harvest from their own estate. This has a big positive impact for log exports from New Zealand because that equates to a 50 million tonne per year reduction in volume into their processing. Now that's the equivalent of the import volume from all markets each year. So we're about 2 years into that process and really starting to see the benefits of that now, and I'll talk through that on this slide. Again, Sumitomo, we love running our numbers, and it's really important to us. So this represents the port inventory levels, and for those of you who get our monthly export update, you'll recognise this graph. This shows what inventory looked like at the port at any one time, looking back over the last sort of 6 years. And this is an important indicator for us because you can see it's quite heavily correlated with price landed in China as well, which is the blue line. And historically we used to see this 2.5 kind of million cubic metre level as a healthy market level. Anything over that, we started to get a little bit nervous. If it got up to 3.5 million, where we are now, we'd get very nervous. If it got up to 4 million, like it did here, we would be packing ourselves. And history's shown in that regard, it was up a staircase and down an elevator with price. But with demand changing, we're seeing this change over time, and I've tried to represent that with the green line on this slide as well. Obviously, we've got new ports in China, 11 new ports over a 10-year period, and much more processing as well. So we now see a healthy level in China around about where we are now at 3.5 million cubic metres at any one time. And I think that's pretty well represented there, that these spikes in volume, which seasonally happen over Chinese New Year, aren't really impacting on price as much as we've seen in the past. I'll only touch on the slide briefly because I keep talking about it, but obviously we see India, China being our two biggest growth markets, and Korea sort of just trundling along at a pretty stable rate. Again, Sumitomo, we love our numbers, so we always analyse what our competitors will be doing in terms of supply as well. You may ask why I've got US housing starts up there. This is really important for us, obviously, in terms of how much domestic volume the US processing is taking up, because obviously the US and Canada are quite big exporters of volume into China as well. So positive for us in that the housing starts in the US are expected to continue to increase. A result of that is we see Canadian log exports to China forecast to decrease slightly in the years to come, and we see US being relatively stable. Russia is a big supplier of volume into China, and it stands to reason because they're next door neighbours. They don't compete with us largely because we're into southern China, whereas they're northern China, until some bright spark builds a big railway between the north and the south. So their volume's going to increase, but the big mover in the recent years has been Australia, but we forecast them to be fairly flat in the coming years. Again, we love our numbers, and we always want to know what the supply deficit or demand deficit's going to be. So from all I guess countries trading into China and those other Asian markets, we forecast by 2020 that the supply deficit will be 12 million jazz. And what do I mean by that? I mean that demand in those Asian markets is going to outstrip supply by about 12 million jazz per year. So that's positive for us. We forecast that to rise by another 3 million jazz over the coming 5 years. So that's positive for us. What does this mean in terms of price, which is, I guess, what you're all keen on hearing about as well? Well, fortunately, our numbers validate what MPI think as well. So we all forecast that prices are going to increase over the coming years and for the foreseeable future too. Now, obviously, we can be a bit conservative at times, but even when running our numbers, our base case, worst case, and best case all confirm that we think the prices are going to increase. And what's driving that? Well, for us, we obviously see this demand outstripping supply, but we also see the further value add that's being made into our softwood species in these markets. Talk about shipping briefly again, and I'll only talk about this really briefly. With shipping, you couldn't get probably a more supply and demand curve kind of driven market in that obviously we reached a really low point down around this time. So what happens there? Shipping owners go bust, they scrap a lot of vessels, and then demand outweighs supply, so the market rebounds. We get up to around about here where we are now, which mimics what's happened in previous years, and then ship owners are making money again, they get confident, they start building vessels, these new builds come online, and then obviously demand is outstripped by supply, so the price goes down. So hopefully, if those graphs or history tells us, then we might be nearing the top there again, which would be great. Let's talk about changing market context just really quickly, just to put in context, obviously, some of the changes that have occurred in history over time. So in a relatively short period, we went from the Wright brothers' first flight to landing on the moon, if you're not a conspiracy theorist. Over a 40-year period, we've gone from computers looking like this to obviously the multiple devices and cloud-based technology we see today. So what do we see happening with, I guess, export markets and forestry? Well, my personal belief is obviously we're going through such a rapid period of growth in terms of population and GDP growth within these markets. And if you look back over the last 10 years, boy, we've achieved a lot in terms of how much volume we're putting into these markets and growth in our forest export earnings, etc. So looking forward, we see that we're probably in the midst of quite a big market context change for our industry, and we forecast a lot of this growth to continue. I'll only talk about this really, really briefly, but just to put some other thoughts in mind here, I think we're in a very fortunate position here in New Zealand with global deforestation. Obviously, 13 million hectares are being deforested per year. Why do I put this up? Well, we live in obviously an environment where we've got lots of sustainable, well-managed plantation forests. We've got, I guess, robust legislation, and we're very well trusted. So what that means for us with deforestation is obviously a lot of these tropical rainband forests are being locked up, and that's great for us because obviously it provides opportunity for radiata to get into those markets, for them to understand the versatility of it, and obviously, I guess, go into higher end uses, which some of those tropical species are used for. And just to talk quickly on that as well, obviously, some countries are now requiring legally verified timber as the only kind of source of fibre that can go in. So that puts us in a good space, and that's happening in Korea at the moment. So I'll wrap up really quickly because I think I'm probably over time. But yes. So sorry about that. But obviously, and I'll talk, I won't cover this in too much detail, but we see basically a lot of other opportunity for fibre out of New Zealand as well. And as the economies get greener, as things like Fukushima have happened, and there's a move from nuclear energy to cleaner, greener energy, and then we see obviously a lot of opportunity for that lower grade part of the log and leftover waste as well. So thanks very much for listening to me. It's hard to, I guess, know what the future holds looking forward, but obviously as a company, as an exporter, and as an investor, we genuinely think that the outlook looks bright. So